Have you ever wondered what happened to the NFL teams that seem to have disappeared from memory? Well, we're going to explore some of these great teams and what became of them and where they may be now. Coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes at PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal of positive football history. And once again, in the efforts to preserve football history, and in this case, professional football history, we're going to cover some of the National Football League teams and APFA teams, which was the NFL was called in its first 2 years, 1920 and 1921, the American Professional Football Association. And we're going to explore some of these teams and what they did as successes, where their failures were, and how long they lasted and what became of them in our edition today. So we're going to cover teams like the Canton Bulldogs, the Massillon Tigers, Akron Pros, and more, and some of these original teams in the APFA, as well as a few others that are very famous to football. So first of all, let's get into some of these early teams. Now, the first one we'd like to talk about is the Massillon Tigers, who were founded in 1903 in Massillon, Ohio, and they lasted through the 1923 season before folding. Now, Massillon was the mythical Ohio League champions, which was sort of that group of teams that were sort of centered in the Midwest, a lot of them in Ohio, commonly called the Ohio League. And they were the champions of Ohio in 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906, and after the scandal in 1906, they merged into the all-Massillon team in 1907 and to win yet another title. They were competitive for much of their next decade, competing a lot with the Shelby Blues and the Akron teams and Cleveland teams and the Canton Bulldogs, and never really regained that strong glory they had in their earlier years. And in 1919, they had a really good team, but sort of some of their players disbanded and left them and formed the Cleveland Tigers. Interesting choice of mascot name there. And they never really were the same, weren't powerful enough really to, though they were considered and wanted by the APFA to join that original NFL teams, invited to the meetings. They never did join and went disbanded in 1923 after the success of the NFL and them sort of falling by the wayside. Another team up from New York was an original APFA team, the Buffalo All-Americans, they were known then. But before that, over the years, they were the Buffalo All-Stars in 1915 through 1917, Buffalo Niagaras in 1918, Buffalo Prospects in 1919, the All-Americans, which team we're talking about from 1920 to 1923, as an original APFA/NFL franchise. They later went on to be the Buffalo Bisons in 24 and 25, and the Buffalo Rangers in 1926, and another version of the Buffalo Bisons in 1927 1929. Now, they joined the NFL APFA as an original member, and in the first season, there was controversy as the team, they were tied with the best record with Akron and Decatur. But after some late season games, Akron ended up tying both Buffalo and the Staleys, and who each had suffered a loss. But the Akron Pros in a February off-season meeting were declared as the original APFA champions because of their undefeated season, and much to the dismay of the Buffalo All-Americans and the Decatur Staleys. The following year was another nod at sort of losing out, just missing on a championship of the league. The Staley Swindle is what it was called, and they had an undefeated record of 9-0-2 to finish what they believed was the end of the regular season. They still wanted to regain some more funds for both the franchise and the players, so they scheduled 2 road games that they thought were exhibitions. They traveled to play that tough Akron Pros team that won the APFA the first year, and They beat them rather handily, then jumped on a train, traveled all night up to Chicago, and played the Chicago Staleys of George Halas, and ended up losing to them. The team was weary coming off the train. Staleys were well rested and sort of pounded the Buffalo team pretty good. But they said, that's all good. It was just an exhibition game. We earned our money by these 2 road games. But old George Halas went to the NFL and said, no, that game counted. And now the Staleys are the champions. A few months later at the league meetings, the Staleys were crowned the champions. Buffalo sort of, by many standards, got screwed again out of a championship. And the story goes on and on there. They ended up never really being able to regain that same powerhouse team they had. 1923 was a little bit more mediocre, and as we said, they turned into some other teams later on. Another team from Western New York, the Rochester Jeffersons, is an original franchise of Leo Lions starting in the early 20th century, late 19th century even. And the Jets were perennial powers in the Western New York as well before World War I. 1920, they joined the original APFA squads on that roster and schedule of the teams, and really never found a lot of success there. He won some games here and there early on, but later on in the mid-20s, they sort of fell by the wayside, and they folded in 1925 after that season. The Akron Pros that we talked about earlier, of course, they were unbeaten in 1920 and were awarded the first APFA title, and was many consider the first NFL championship. They were founded in 1908, and the Akron 11 was great right out of the gate. They were power earlier with 4 mythical Ohio League championships, 1908, 1909, 1913, and 1914. The club folded after the 1927 season. The Canton Bulldogs, probably the most famous of these defunct teams, the mythical Ohio League champions in 1915, 1916, 1917, under the watchful eye and talent of a great squad, Guy Chamberlain and Pete Henry, and even Jim Thorpe playing on those early teams there. And they won the NFL title in 1922 and 1923. The team was broke up somewhat in 1924 when they were sold and merged with the Cleveland team, became the Cleveland Bulldogs, who ended up in 1924 winning the National Football League championship. But Canton tried to restore their team, just never could really get the same respect that they were and same records, the great records and teams they had and when they were before going to that Cleveland thing. And they become defunct in 1927. Of course, the Pro Football Hall of Fame was awarded to the city of Canton because Canton Bulldogs owner Ralph Hay hosted the inaugural meeting in August of 1920 that sort of organized the APFA, which became the NFL. So Canton won that Pro Football Hall of Fame museum spot. The Cleveland Tigers was a team that existed in 1916 through 1921, partially created from players that left the Massillon Tigers. As we said earlier, Peggy Perrott was their biggest name as he led this formidable team. They, of course, folded in 1921 after 2 seasons in the APFA. Chicago Tigers were an original franchise at APFA as well. They were a one-year wonder of Gull Falcone, and they went by the wayside after that first season. The Columbus Panhandles. It was a club that was made famous by the brains of Joe Carr, who organized and sort of owned the team when they became professional, and the talented muscle of the famous Nesser family. Many brothers played there. They were founded and staffed by the majority of train yard mechanics and yard workers in the train yards. And the club lasted from 1901 through the 1926 season. They played in what many consider to be the first NFL game against the next team we're going to talk about, the Dayton Triangles, who, yes, hosted and soundly defeated, I believe it was 14-0, October 3rd, 1920. They beat the Panhandles. Dayton played through the 1930 season when they were relocated and rebranded as the Brooklyn Dodgers Football Club in the NFL. The Detroit Heralds were a team that started in 1905 and joined the original franchises of the APFA in 1920. However, their first league season bid them in 1921, and the Detroit's pro team was then the Tigers, and that next year the APFA. The Muncie Flyers, originally founded and playing as the Congersville, and the Flyers moved to Muncie and had APFA ties in 1920 and 1921 before abandoning their league franchise and becoming an independent again under some other names. The Rock Island Independents, they were founded in the Quad Cities area in 1907. The team had a great run of successes with 5 undefeated seasons, 1908, 1910, 1912, 13, and 18, and a self-proclaimed title in 1919. And the APFA/NFL in 1920 and stayed in it through 1925 when they jumped ship to Red Grange's AFL in the 1926 season and then never returned to major organized pro football leagues after that. I don't think they were welcome to come back in the NFL after going to with CC Pyle and Red Grange in that opponent league that opposed the NFL. The Pottsville Maroons, another famous team, lost championship in 1925 due to a dispute with the NFL brass over an exhibition game with the Notre Dame All-Stars, a team of alumni from that school in South Bend. And they played that game in Philadelphia, which was the home of the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who we will talk about in a second. So the NFL told them not to do it beforehand. They did it anyway to make revenue in a larger stadium, and they lost their championship even though they had the best record in the NFL. That was given to the Chicago Cardinals. Now, they hung around as a team from 1920 and as an indie in the Anthracite League, and an NFL squad from 1925 to 1929 were the Pottsville Maroons. The Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who we talked about a little bit, they were founded in Philadelphia suburbs in 1899 as a Frankfurt Athletic Club, and the Frankfurt team joined the NFL in 1924 and lasted through the 1931 season when their operations were suspended. They won the NFL championship in 1926, and the club's charter was bought and rebranded by Bert Bell in 1933 as the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, there's 2 original APFA teams that we did not mention, the Chicago Cardinals. Well, they never went defunct. They later on in the 1960s became the St. Louis Cardinals, and then after about 3 decades in that fine city, they moved further west to the desert of Arizona, and they were the Phoenix Cardinals, and now the Arizona Cardinals, and we know their history, so they are the longest lasting and existing original franchise that's stayed intact all the time. Another team that has some claims to early ties, the Decatur Staleys became the Chicago Staleys in 1921, and the Chicago Bears in 1922, George Halas founding them, taking them from that industrial team of A.E. Staley and Company in Decatur, Illinois, to become Chicago, Illinois' pride of the Bears that still play to this day. So they never went defunct either. But there you have it. There's your original APFA teams and many defunct teams. Teams that maybe, like Massillon was never part of the APFA. Frankfurt and Pottsville were teams that were never part of the APFA, joined the NFL after the first 4 or 5 seasons. And there you have it. Those are probably your most famous defunct teams. There are multitudes of other defunct teams that played pro football in other leagues, and there's a bunch of NFL teams that we didn't mention, the sort of asterisks in the roster and schedules of other teams. And maybe another episode we'll talk about some of those, but those are your more famous defunct teams in the NFL and what happened to them. And we hope this preserved a little bit of football history and cleared up the air. We have much more detail on each of these teams as they each have their own section on Pigskin Dispatch, and they each have their own podcast dedicated to them, some with some expert help and some with some research by yours truly. So make sure you look those up, and we will talk to you next time. Until then, have a great gridiron day.
We're taking a peek over at the chains and the down marker. It's 4th and long. We're going to have to punt the ball and get on out of here, but we'll have another series tomorrow for your football history headlines, so be sure to tune in. We invite you to check out our website, pigskinddispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. PigskinDispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast. PigskinDispatch.com is a proud affiliate of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.